My name is Тобиас Флессенкемпер, and I'm part of the cooperators for this forum from the Centre International de Formation Européenne, which is a logo which you also see up there, CIFE, and we are a French higher education and research institute based in Nice, dealing with European affairs for far more than 60 years. And I'm delighted to have two very distinguished guests tonight here for the conversation, and this will be very much an EU discussion. Yes, we want to discuss about continuities and discontinuities in the EU's foreign and security policy. To my left, I have the Member of Parliament, Yоханнес Šrapс from the German Federal Parliament. He was elected last year, and you'll find a bit more of his biography in the information booklet. And he will talk about a German parliamentary view on EU foreign and security policy, as he's a member of the EU Affairs Committee, but also I think a deputy member, or I don't know exact term, and also a substitute member, that's what it's called, substitute members of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the German Parliament. To my right, Chарльz Granт from the Center for European Reform from London, the UK. And I want to start with Charles, because he brings, together with Yоханнес and me, we bring together here a bit like three different phases of Europeanization, as Charles has lived through the European project as a correspondent of The Economist and as a journalist already in the 80s, while I entered the scene in European affairs so a couple of years later, and Yоханnес then yet another couple of years later. So we can very much look through the three different eyes how we lived Europeanization, and we also how we lived the emergence of EU foreign and security policy. So Charles, continuity and discontinuity, what comes to your mind sitting here in Belarus in the year 2018 when you think about foreign and security policy of the European Union? Are there continuities and discontinuities?
The starting point is that most European countries have a lot of interests in common. They're rather small on their own, so it makes sense if they pool their interests and work together. And indeed, I was at the Maastricht Summit, which gave birth to the idea of a common foreign security policy, CFSP, in 1991, at the same time as it gave birth to the euro. And the achievements have been mixed, I think. The first point I'd like to make is that the EU's ability to shape the environment around it and to shape the rest of the world depends on how strong it is internally. When the EU is riven by crises, it's less influential in the world. And at the moment, it's not a great time. We have Brexit, which is certainly a bigger problem for the EU than many people in Brussels realise at the moment. It certainly weakens the EU's foreign policy. You've got the unresolved euro crisis and migration crises, two very serious sets of problems which are not slightly in abeyance this year, but they're not going to come back. They have helped to drive a wave of populism across Europe, which has led this week to the appointment of a new government in Italy, run by two Eurosceptic parties, and some of the senior figures in that government want to destroy the euro from the inside. None of this is very helpful. Then we have another manifestation of populism in the rift between Poland and Hungary to the east of the EU and the West European countries over quotas of refugees, over the rule of law, and over much else. So when the EU is disunited and beset with problems, it has less influence, fairly obviously so. And of course, the big member states, Britain, France, and Germany, were never that keen to hand over powers to the EU in the area of foreign policy anyway, because they would rather do their own thing, at least some of the time. But given all that, let's not belittle the EU's achievements. The Iran nuclear deal, which Trump is trying to destroy, which has persuaded Iran, at least for now, to abandon its nuclear program, was started off by Javier Solana, the EU's foreign policy chief, about 15 years ago. Britain, France, and Germany made it happen. America helped later, so did Russia and China. The EU is often united. When Russia did what it did in Ukraine, in the Crimea and the Donbass, the EU was united in imposing sanctions on Russia, even though some member states had reservations. On climate change, the EU's had a united position and helped to give birth to the Paris Climate Change Accord. the Balkans, the EU has helped to give peace to the Balkans, so if it takes away the promise of membership from some of the member states, it may destabilise the Balkans. There have been failures as well, of course, and we've been a lot of discussion here about the European neighbourhood policy, one part of which is the Eastern Partnership, which has been certainly very mixed, and we perhaps come back to that in the discussion. Just to conclude, one word on European defence, then one word on today's challenges. I mean, European defence is a very good idea because NATO depends on American involvement, and there will be times when the EU wants to do things when the Americans don't want to be involved. So it does make sense for the Europeans to develop their own capabilities. There have been a number of successful peacekeeping operations and humanitarian relief operations in the Balkans, Africa, and elsewhere. But frankly, the Brexit issue is a big difficulty for European defence, because so much of Europe's defence capability and its research budget and its equipment budget is the British. And it's not looking that good. I mean, I hope that we get a good-natured Brexit where everybody's reasonable and rational and nice to each other, but it may not be that easy. Just this week, there's a big drum about the Galileo satellite system, the European rival or equivalent to the GPS. The Commission is trying to exclude the British from this, which means the British are now threatening to withdraw security cooperation with the EU after Brexit. That's not very good for those of us who wish for a strong European defence policy. But there are also tensions between France and Germany on defence. The Germans have been a bit behind the setting up so-called PESCO, which is a sort of avant-garde group for defence cooperation, but it actually has 25 countries in it, so it's hardly a real avant-garde. The Germans wanted the criteria to be low so everybody could take part. The French are unhappy about that. They want a smaller, more select club, so they're setting up a rival called the European Intervention Initiative. So there are different perspectives. The bottom line is European defence will be effective if A, governments spend more money on it, B, they can develop a strategic culture of the sort the British and the French have, which is actually being prepared to use force if you need to use it. Finally, I'd say the future of European foreign policy will be defined by how Europe manages to relate to the four main powers that surround it, one of which is America. The European response to Trump could be to seek more strategic autonomy, given that Trump is taking a line that's very different from the European line on climate, on trade, on the Iran nuclear deal. It could, as Macron, the French president, desires, persuade the Europeans to develop more autonomy in defence and foreign policy to do their own thing. But if defence budgets remain no, and we'll hear from our friend from the German Bundestag in a minute, but I think your party, Johannes, is not very keen on a much bigger German defence budget. You'll tell us in a minute. But if you're not prepared to spend money, then it's hard to really set up the strategic autonomy in coping with America. And we actually do remain dependent on America. Then there's Russia. And if Russia was very clever, I think it could split the Europeans apart when the renewal of EU sanctions on Russia comes up because of the Ukraine crisis. Because you now have a government in Italy that is basically pro-Russian. If Russia came up with a peace plan for the Donbass, quite a lot of its friends in the EU would say, hey, Russia's trying to make peace, let's not renew the sanctions, and then the EU would be divided in dealing with Russia. I'm not sure, others will know more than me, I'm not sure Russia is ready to come up with a peace plan for the Donbass, but it would need to do so in order probably to split the Europeans apart. But that is another challenge for the Europeans. Then there's Turkey. The Europeans are quite united in Turkey, united behind the charade of accession talks, pretending that Turkey wants to join, they will join the EU, and Turkey pretend it wants to join, but both sides think it makes sense to keep on talking to each other, which may be right. The problem with the EU faces on Turkey is that its concern about human rights would lead it to shun Turkey and condemn it. There are more journalists in prison in Turkey than any other country in the world, but realpolitik determines that the EU has to talk to Turkey because Turkey's stemmed the flow of refugees into Europe from the Middle East, and the EU needs Turkey's cooperation on that, counter-terrorism and many other issues. That's a dilemma for the Europeans. And then finally China, the fourth power that the EU has to contend with. The Europeans are fairly united on China, but not always. China's very good at sowing discord amongst the Europeans. Whenever a motion comes up to condemn China on its human rights policy, Greece, Cyprus and a few others intervene to block it because they want Chinese investment and are happy to do what the Chinese ask them to do. Then there's the 16+1 grouping, a very clever Chinese initiative where China meets with 16 East European countries, some in the EU, some not in the EU, promises them investment in infrastructure, and as a result, China has a kind of club of friends in Europe who will complain if European foreign policy ever gets too critical on China. So these are the challenges: Russia, China, Turkey, America. How the EU responds to those four powers which surround it will determine the future for EU foreign policy. But there are very many difficulties, but don't underestimate what the EU foreign policy has achieved already. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. But you mentioned four. I'd add a fifth one, the United Kingdom. What kind of cooperation do you foresee in terms of foreign policy post-Brexit? Because, I mean, the United Kingdom has played, as you said, a very instrumental role in making foreign policy operational with the peace missions in the Balkans, but also in terms of being a player at the level of the United Nations Security Council, often gathering the EU countries there.
Well, I hope Britain stays a very close, constructive partner for the EU. It may, in the end, do so. The narrative of the leading Brexiteers who led Britain out of Europe was, let's not be shackled to a moribund monster, the EU. Let's break free from the shackles and let's go off and work with the Anglosphere, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries who share our values. That was the narrative of Boris Johnson, who's now the Foreign Secretary, and others. The trouble is, soon after Brexit, the Americans elected Trump, and even right-wing British Eurosceptics find Trump quite hard to stomach. So when Trump opposes free trade, when he opposes the Iran nuclear agreement, when he opposes climate change accords, even right-wing Brits say, actually, we better line up with the EU, not with the US. So rationality would determine we line up closely with the EU, but I'm worried that the very ill-natured nature of the Brexit negotiations which are underway at the moment may make that rather hard, but I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you. Johannes, there was a very specific question already to your government's position on defense spending and the defense cooperation in Europe. But let us start a bit broader and on continuity and discontinuities maybe as well from the side of the German government with regard to EU foreign policy. EU foreign policy was something very important traditionally. How important it is now for this government?
Perhaps first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, because as you can imagine, as a newly elected member of parliament since last autumn, this is still a quite new situation for me, sitting in such panel and probably being one of the youngest panelists at this conference. But especially because of this situation, for me it's a huge pleasure sitting here together with you and discussing about German foreign policy or European foreign policy. And that's a good question that you asked in the beginning. Perhaps you are a little surprised having such young parliamentarians sitting here talking about European and foreign politics, because especially foreign politics and European politics is something that you are dealing with very often if you are dealing with a certain country or with these kind of policies for a certain period of time, because you need a lot of expertise, you need a lot of experience to know about these things and to be able to judge it in a certain way. If you're new in these topics, it's much more difficult to judge these things and also to talk about these things. I will try that nevertheless. And perhaps it's also a chance that you can see in a positive way to have a young person thinking about things that mostly older politicians deal with in general. But to come back to your question, I think German foreign politics was something very important, and it is still, but it has to be embedded better within the European Union common foreign policy. I think a lot of things that Charles already mentioned are very important, because we have a lot of challenges to solve, but not just as European Union. We have to solve them on the one side within the European Union, and we have to solve challenges from outside. The challenges from outside are already named. The elections in the US with Trump as a leader where you can never expect what he's doing. Growing influence of other players on the global agenda, like China, also like the sheiks. And the influence of Russia. Also, if you think about the impact of new technologies, especially cyber threats, hybrid war is always an argument that you have to think about in this perspective. And the inner European challenges are perhaps bigger because of the Brexit, because also of questions that the Visegrad countries, Hungary, Poland, brought up during the whole last years. If you think about the rule of law, if you think about these questions, there's kind of a split within the European Union where we really have to take care that we keep the Union together. And this whole situation has a lot of influence on the common European neighborhood policy, on the common European foreign policy as well. And therefore I think we have to take this situation that we can't rely on partners anymore as we did during the whole last decades, especially the United States. You already mentioned the importance of the involvement of the US if you think about the NATO. And if you think about European foreign policy, I think this can be a chance to develop a European foreign policy, common European foreign policy, if you can't rely on your partners anymore as you did before. But that's a challenge, of course, and it's a challenge for the nation states. Because if you want to develop a European common foreign policy, the nation states have to give influence to the European level. And that's something that is tough, that is also tough for German politics, but we have to do that.
But let me jump into this. I mean, there comes my middle generation thing. When Maastricht Treaty, I left school, started studying, and during that time in the early 90s, there was a lot of talk about, we should have majority decisions in foreign policy. Now, that was a moment of complete weakness of the European Union foreign policy. This was a war in the Balkans. What emerges now, in a time also in, say, strategic weakness vis-à-vis the Middle East, also people talk about we should have majority decisions in foreign policy. It seems to me that one of the continuities is that there's always talk about transfer to making foreign policy stronger in situations of relative weakness of the European Union. And that the kind of impulse to get into a new mode of operation follows maybe a couple of years later only. Is that maybe some continuity, discontinuity, Charles, you can agree on?
Well, not entirely. I'm afraid though in British terms I count as a pro-European, my friends in Brussels don't think I'm very pro-European because I'm an intergovernmentalist, meaning in some areas like foreign policy, I don't want the Commission to run things. I don't think majority voting is the answer to all the problems. And to be honest, what's wrong with EU foreign policy, to me, is that the big member states have not been committed to making it work. I don't think voting rules is the biggest problem. Think back to the Iraq War 2003. There was actually a small majority of states then for invading Iraq against France and Germany's wishes. If we'd had majority voting, France and Germany would have been outvoted and forced to invade Iraq or forced to support the invasion. Just, on issues like that, you have to allow countries the right to veto or the right to do their own things. I don't think the biggest problem is the lack of majority voting. The biggest problem is developing a common analysis, perception of common interests, and political leaders making the case to their electorates that they have so much in common with their other fellow European countries. They need to work together, and they can achieve so much more if they work together. I think it's a political task more than a voting rule.
Yeah, I think you're right in that. But we have to make the big member states to commit to make that work.
Yes.
And that's the important thing. I think we tried to start with that in Germany during the negotiations of our coalition treaty that is hopefully going to be implemented during the last years. Because especially in the European chapter within this coalition treaty between the Conservative Party and my party, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, as Social Democrats, we negotiated into this chapter that Germany will spend more money within the next European budget. which is one important step from my point of view to make also other European countries able to say, okay, if Germany as one of the biggest players within the European Union will spend more money, the others will do that too. They didn't do yet, but I hope we can push them to do it too, because we have this 14 billion euros that we can't use anymore because of the Brexit. Okay, there's money as well that is not going to Great Britain the other way around, but there is a gap, there is a hole, there is money that is not there anymore, and we have to fill this gap somehow. And I think it was an important step as the German government, the new German government, to say we would like to try to fill at least a part of this gap with additional money. Mm-hmm. That was one important sentence within this treaty. Nevertheless, there are still discussions within the German parliament and within the German government too, if we should say this sentence without knowing what this money will be spent for. And that's the next question. Also, if we say as Germans we will spend more money within the European budget in view of the negotiations for the new multi-annual framework from 2021 till 2028, we need to take care that, for example, for the Eastern Partnership initiatives, there's at least the same amount of money, or there's more money for the European neighborhood policy.
Mm-hmm. From the strategics, to quickly, still on the China question, because we just had a China panel. Some of you may have attended it. It's actually fascinating. For me as an observer outside, you have the 16+1 with an increasing rhythm of meetings. I think there was one in November in Budapest, and the next one, in Budapest. The next one is scheduled in a short time. You have individual governments of the European Union member states traveling nicely to China, meeting today or the last days. Ms. Merkel was there. And it seems relatively uncoordinated, everything going on with China. In particular with regards to issues which are becoming much more important in terms of trade policy. Wouldn't we like to see rather a continuity of a forceful EU delegation going to China defending trade interests, rather than individual member states or 16+1 groupings all trying to engage with China in different terms?
Well, that's a very good question. Before answering the question directly, let me just say one of the problems in transatlantic relations is that the Americans, understandably being a global superpower, see China not just as a commercial entity, not just as a place to trade with and have trade arguments with. They worry about China geostrategically, and they get very frustrated with we Europeans, because we Europeans, at least most EU countries, see China as a place of opportunity to trade with and make money in. And we don't like to think about the South China Sea or the East China Sea or other strategic questions, which is very frustrating for Americans. But be that as it may, that is a source of tension in the transatlantic relationship. And as far as the EU itself is concerned, I think Germany is a bit of a problem in a way, because Germany is so big and has such a strong relationship with China and exports so much to China, I think 4 or 5 times what Britain exports, and more than any other European country by a long way. That the Germans, understandably, although they have to work through the EU's boring old common commercial policy, they like to do their own bilateral diplomacy. Mrs. Merkel often takes a plane load full of business leaders to China for bilateral diplomacy, which is understandable, but it's for the people sitting in Brussels in the European Commission who are trying to run trade policy, they get a bit frustrated with Mrs. Merkel's bilateralism at times. So I think, again, if you are trying to persuade China to open its markets, as we all are trying to do in Europe, because China is sometimes quite protectionist, if we work together through the European Commission, we're more likely to get there. But I'd like to hear what Johannes would say about that.
And I know the member state that Ms. Merkel represents best, but I think it's the same for Mr. Macron, who was recently there, and also for the Austrian government, which came in force to China. That would be a concrete thing of not only on the strategic level, but how do you reinforce maybe in the next period EU-China relations in where the EU has a competence vis-à-vis member states and trade policy, but maybe also on the strategic level?
Yeah, I think it would be also in German interest to act as common Europeans if you negotiate with China. I think in Germany, and that's why I agree with you, with your sentences you said, although I'm German, that especially our trade imbalances that we have a huge export, are not always very good, also not for our European partners. But we have to have European solidarity from the German perspective to the others, if we would like to ask for solidarity in other terms. And that's why it's important to implement such common European foreign policy also in trade or economic questions, because it makes Europe stronger itself. We tend in Germany a little bit to the thoughts that we can do that alone. It's a little bit also the basic thoughts from my point of view that ended up in a Brexit in Great Britain, that they thought they can do that on themselves. They have their stable environment nevertheless, so they can do all the things themselves. That's what we tend to in Germany sometimes as well, that we see ourselves as a very strong player within the European Union, and there are some people that think that we don't need the others. They don't say that, but the thoughts are there. But that's something I think that the younger generation has a different view on, because we grew up, or my generation as well, we grew up with all the achievements that the European Union brought to us, and we don't want to lose them. That we can travel everywhere, that we can pay with the same money. I don't need to count all these things, but we are used to have close contacts between each other, and for us, like living in a European environment and having friends in every single country within the European Union, because we can study in every European country, we work in different countries. We have these connections that are so important for this European, or for thinking in a European way. And I think that's why it's so important that the younger generation raise their voice in this question as well, and that can lead to a common behavior of the European countries. But therefore we still have to bring our older colleagues in the parliaments on the right track. Let me say it that way.
But don't get off this hook here, because the younger generation, if I look at Di Maio, Salvini, I mean, they're the younger generation, they're your generation in Italy. And for Italy, this has been maybe a different 20 years than for you. So now this is not foreign policy issue, but it's something about the inner functioning, what you refer to as well. So maybe this inner functioning needs some sort of review as well. Because, I mean, they're clearly not there to strengthen EU foreign policy. I didn't hear them talking about that. I heard them talking about what you said, find an own way to interact with other regional powers. They have a known vision about the monetary policy. So the younger generation may differ from where you are young.
Perhaps you're right, and perhaps that's something that I have to learn too. Nevertheless, I think that the younger generation that benefit from the achievements of the European Union is not in every country as same active. And there are countries where parts of the younger generation don't benefit as much as in other countries, perhaps in Italy as well. But they will notice too. I think, I don't know, if you see the new government, perhaps there's another young generation.
Let's see.
That was not that active in political discussions yet, but perhaps they will be if they notice that their country is going to a wrong direction.
Let me move it to the last question on the panel, and then, ladies and gentlemen, it's also up to you to interact with our panelists and make comments or questions. And this one would actually refer to the EU foreign policy in the field of Eastern Partnership. And my question is very simple. What were the 5 best points about the Eastern Partnership so far?
Well, let me slightly modify the question. What are the 5 best points about the neighbourhood policy? Because we mustn't forget, even though we're sitting in Belarus, that the EU has difficult, troubled neighbourhood to its south as well as its east, and it's perhaps wrongly tried to lump them together in one thing called the neighbourhood policy. I think the places where it's worked not so badly are Morocco, Tunisia, Moldova, partly, which not a country I know well, and in some ways it's worked well in Ukraine, because it has actually, the whole point of the neighbourhood policy was set up by Romano Prodi, the then Commission President in 2004, was to create a ring of friends around us by offering money, markets and mobility, the 3 M's. It hasn't been as successful as it should have done. It hasn't managed to shape the neighbourhood in a positive way in many countries because there wasn't enough money. We didn't open our markets enough, particularly to the Mediterranean fruit growers, and we didn't offer much labour mobility either. So my take would be, to get a better, more influential neighbourhood policy, the EU has to increase its offer, more money, more political contacts as well, more markets, more mobility. We need to offer more. I think Macron's got the answer. Macron's posited a multi-circle Europe, the Eurozone core, then an outer rim of countries not in the Euro like Poland and Sweden, and then a third rim for Montenegro, Moldova, Macedonia and Great Britain when it wants to rejoin an outer rim.
And how do we deal with the issue of mobility in Britain? It seems that Britain doesn't want so much mobility, neither of EU citizens nor of third country nationals.
That's true, but since the referendum, if you look at the opinion polls, migration as a problem has gone right down in Britain, because what people wanted to be told was they would have control, whatever that means. So they don't actually mind there being lots of foreigners, so long as they are not obliged to take them and they can stop them if they really wish to. So I think the future regime for EU migration that Mrs May's government adopts, as it's probably, is going to be relatively liberal. If you have a job offer, you'll be able to come and work in the UK. But in principle, the UK will be able to close the doors if it wishes to. But it's not going to be that stringent, the regime, which is good news for those of us who wish for an open Britain.
Mm. The 5 best points about the neighbourhood, or if you want, the Eastern Partnership.
I did talk about the important environment that is important for Germany with their European partners, but that it's the same with the European Union and their environment around. So that's why I strongly believe that the future of the European Union depends very much also on the situation in its neighborhood. And that's why we have to have a very strong interest in supporting the ideas of conflict resolution and stuff like that. Because we have a very strong impact out of these conflicts as well. If we talk about refugee crisis, migration, things like that, we are affected by these things. So if we would like to have, or if we want to have a stable environment, we have to deal with these things. And I think that it was always very strong from the European perspective to put a very strong focus on diplomacy and to transport in a way of soft power, to transport European values, or values is not always the best term, but to transport European values to the neighborhood as well. And I think especially, for example, the interparliamentary platforms or the intergovernmental platforms are very important for that. For example, the Baltic Sea Cooperation is one thing. The Union for the Mediterranean is another thing, where you have the European neighborhood countries participating plus the European Union countries. And we have to strengthen these platforms to have a closer contact, to know each other, and to work closer with each other. And if you get closer and closer, you can solve the conflicts easier, perhaps.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we are in conversation, so I can't see anything. I can see a bit here. There's a gentleman there. I don't know how it works with the microphones. And in the back, you really have to stand up if you want to take the floor, because I can't see it from here. Please introduce yourself.
My name is David Quinn. I'm the Director of Development for the Thompson Foundation. Short question, probably a possibly long answer. How do you think Brexit is going to impact upon the development of the European neighbourhood policy?
Right. Anyone? Oh, there's a gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Volodymyr Khandogi from Ukraine, and I'm the president of the Ukrainian Foreign Policy Association. First of all, I would like to react a little bit, just briefly, on the neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership. I would like to make it clear here that, although I do not represent the official position now, but from the very beginning, the Eastern neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership was never in Ukraine something that we regarded as added value. So we based our relations with the European Union on the bilateral track, and of course after the signing of the association agreement, now the incentives that allegedly should the neighborhood policy provide for its members seems for us not really valid. So that's a reaction on this. But my question was to bring it back a little bit on the foreign and security policy of the EU and the place for the defense policy in this sort of situation. I used to remember back in maybe 10-15 years ago, there was a lot of talk about the distinctive EU defense policy, including the headquarters in Tervuren in Belgium. And what is the situation now? How this concept of the common defense policy in the EU is going, in particular in view of the pronouncements from Washington about lack of sort of resources that are allocated from the European Union, and of course regarding the pronouncements from Europe, that America is no longer a reliable partner.
Thank you. A very long and complicated to answer question, I'm sure. Here is another person in the third row. And then I would take another one if you raise your hand.
Semeny Alexei, Kiev. I have actually the question also related to, let's say it's called neighborhood policy or Eastern Partnership policy as part of that. Actually, if we backtracking, what started exactly as neighborhood policy in 2003 and quite a good comprehensive project. Then it was Eastern Neighborhood, Mediterranean, and two major aims were actually quite good, very strong and simple, to create all around the European Union the area of prosperity and stability. Now we have 15 years after. What do we have now? Area of mostly instability and with prosperity quite huge problems. The question is, regarding all the process brought from outside, be it Arab Spring, be it, let's call it, counterproductive activities of Russian Federation in Eastern Europe, or some other outside actors. But nevertheless, maybe EU has done something wrong with this policy, and if yes, and this is a question to both of speakers, maybe you can name some of these mistakes, or just what should have been done and what could have been done in this regard.
All right, and the lady in the first one.
Thank you. Gabriele Kötschau, former Deputy and Vice President of Parliament in Schleswig-Holstein, Northern Germany, and General Director of the Secretariat of Council of Baltic Sea. My question is, in which regard could the regional organizations such as CBSS, Baltic Sea Parliamentary Conference and others, play a role in cooperation, and in what regard could the Baltic Sea be a model for other regions in Europe?
Right, ladies and gentlemen, that's quite something for my panelists to answer. In total, we have 6 minutes left, okay. So you have each 2.5. I think they're quite evenly distributed. I would leave it to you to start, or you want to start? Yeah. Okay, Johannes starts.
Perhaps I would like to talk about first about the European defensive politics, because I think that's really very important, and it reminded me to answer the question that was set up in the beginning. If Germany wouldn't like to spend more money on defense. No, we wouldn't like to, of course. And I say that very clear. But we started this process coming to perhaps to our European army one day. What we have to think about is that within the European Union, for example, we have a lot of weapon systems, I think 165 or something like that. And it's always compared with the US, where it's just 30. And if we would like to put all these things together, we would like to work together in the European defense policy, and we would like to put our skills together. That also means that in some parts of the European Union, in some countries, weapon systems will get lost. And if this is 165 weapon systems and you would like to downsize it to a level that the US has, for just an example, if we think about that, and this is the way that we are on at the moment, that means that a lot of working places and stuff gets lost in certain countries. And of course the countries think about these things as well. That makes a huge competition between the European countries at the moment, especially between France, between Germany, also between the Netherlands. If you think about ships, for example, there is a huge competition at the moment about this common project, which is kind of going to different directions. But it makes it difficult to force this common European defense policy, because the nation states, they have their own interests as well, because they want to keep their weapon systems as the weapon system for the whole European Union at its best. But they can't, and we just have to be clear with that, and we have to be honest with that with each other as well. And perhaps the last thing,
on the neighborhood policy, maybe you want to take on what went wrong, maybe in neighborhood policy.
Yeah, not the Eastern Partnership. Perhaps it didn't work out pretty well. I wouldn't say so too, if you see the results. But I think if you talk about the development, for example, in Eastern Partnership, then there have been important steps done too. If you talk about the association agreements, visa liberalization with Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, you have a lot of important steps done there, and you have brought the countries closer to the European Union, and you made it possible for the people of these countries to get to the European Union and to have a closer contact. And that's what made us being better within the European Union. That's what I said earlier, that for us it's very usual to have contacts in every European country. And if this gets usual over time for these countries too, it brings them closer to the European Union. But perhaps we don't see the results yet. It doesn't mean that it was everything wrong. But of course we have to rethink about our strategies that we had, if we did mistakes there as well.
All right, Charles?
3 minutes on those 2 points. Bringing together the questions on neighbourhood policy, Brexit won't make much direct impact on the neighbourhood policy, except that there'll be less momentum for EU enlargement. And that in itself impacts on the neighbourhood policy, because Britain, alongside Sweden, was one of the biggest champions of EU enlargement, and still remains while it's in the EU. I didn't explain earlier my remark about Macron and the neighbourhood policy. What I should have said was, Macron's got this idea of a multi-circle EU, concentric circles. The point is, you should have neighbours in the outer circle. If you like, Turkey is in a customs union with the EU, why couldn't Morocco be part of bits of the single market? Why couldn't, well, Ukraine is actually potentially part of bits of the single market with its deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. So offer much more, offer even let these guys, the heads of government, come to the European Council sometimes. You need to bring them into an outer circle much more than we have done. That's what's wrong with the neighbourhood policy.